Greetings in the name of the Most High Yahuwah and his Son, Yahusha, to the 12 tribes that are scattered abroad. I am Brother Hiram, and I am going to be bringing to you in this video part 4 of the series which I have entitled Put Away versus Divorce. And in this video, what we're going to deal with is the question. We're going to answer the question, if Yahusha meant divorce when he spoke of putting away and marrying another, if Yahusha meant divorce, did that put him in conflict with Torah? I have heard it said, Yahusha couldn't have meant divorce because that would put him in conflict with Torah. This line of thinking leads to people reading their preferred interpretation into the scriptures rather than reading the true interpretation out of the scriptures. In other words, we need to be careful about putting parameters and boundaries around the word that Yah may not be putting. Those who believe this need to explore the possibility that Yahusha's teaching against divorce and remarriage conflicts with their understanding of Torah rather than Torah itself. As we know, Proverbs 3:5 says, "Trust in Yahuwah with all your heart, lean not unto your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths." Yahuwah already set the bar in the beginning, as was referenced by Yahusha in his teaching on divorce and remarriage. So in Genesis 1:27, he said he made them male and female. Genesis 2:24, "Therefore a man shall leave father and mother, cleave to his wife, and they two shall be one flesh." And Yahusha expounded upon this by saying they are no longer two, but one flesh. "What therefore Yah has joined together, let not man put asunder," let not man separate. So this bar was set in the very beginning before anything else was ever spoken on the subject. Yahuwah confirmed his standard by enforcing it in 2 of the commandments in the Torah. That's in Deuteronomy 22:19 and Deuteronomy 22:29. Now, these were the situations where a man accused a daughter of Zion of not being a maid, and if she was found to be a maid, then he was to take her hand in marriage. He was to be punished by the elders and fined. And Yahuwah said that he may not put her away all his days. And the same thing with the man who takes a girl's virginity. And it's up to the father now whether he allows that marriage to go forward. But if the father allows the marriage to go forward, Yahuwah says he may not put her away all his days. And so we see Yahuwah's original, creational, universal standard of marriage permanence that he set from the very beginning. We see him enforcing it on these 2 occasions in the Torah. Yahuwah likewise confirmed his standard in the prophets by speaking of the oneness in marriage. Now this is Malachi chapter 2 verse 15. This is the situation where he's rebuking the men of Yehuda because they put away their wives, divorced now, put away in divorce, putting away as the final stage of divorce. They divorced their wives so that they could marry these heathen women who worshiped other mighty ones, because it's talking about the same situation that we see in Ezra chapter 10. But in the midst of this rebuke, Yahuwah asked the question, did he not make them one? So he speaks of the oneness. I made you one with your covenant spouse, and you're wanting to divorce and remarry these heathen women. A better question to ask than that above is this: did Yahuwah speak a law in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4, that put him in conflict with his own word? So that's actually a better question then if Yahusha meant divorce, did that put him in conflict with the Torah? But did Yahuwah speak a law that put him in conflict with himself? Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 and 2. When a man had taken a wife and married her, and it come to pass that she finds no favor in his eyes because he had found some uncleanness in her, then let him write her a bill of divorce and give it in her hand and send her out of his house. And when she is departed out of his house, she may go and be another man's wife. KJV, King James Version. This is how most of you are used to hearing this passage, these two verses. But what I have done here is I'm bringing this thing out in the Hebrew interlinear. We're going to see the actual text, the Hebrew text, Textus Receptus, from which the King James was translated, and we're going to see what it actually says. Now, Hebrew reads from right to left, not left to right like English. So where you see the number 1 on the first line, this is where it begins. It says, when takes a man a wife, or going from right to left, and marries her, and it happens that she finds favor in his eyes, we're going right to left on the second line now, because he has found in her uncleanness some, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it, that's the third line. All right, now I'm just going to stop there, but the third line, let's zero in on this now, the third line. So it says, some, and he writes, we-katab, in the Hebrew, we-katab, and he writes. It doesn't say let him write her. It says, and he writes her a certificate of divorce. And he writes, we-katab. Look at that. Third line. Second word in. Third line. Now, verse 2. So go to the number 2. We're going to read from right to left. It says, and when she has departed from his house and goes and becomes man's wife, second line, another. So this is what it says in the Hebrew text. And so what I want to zero in on is the third word in on the first line here. It says, wehalakah, wehalakah. And it just means and goes. It does not mean and she may go. It just says and goes. Now, when a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes, because he has found some uncleanness in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house, and when she has departed from his house and goes and becomes another man's wife. Now, I brought that out of the New King James, and the reason why I brought that out of the New King James is that although there is no perfect translation, and there are a lot of places where the King James is better than the New King James, and so I'm not trying to exalt one version over another, that the New King James in this particular passage aligns very closely to the Hebrew text, the Textus Receptus, what we just went through. And that's why I brought this out in the New King James. Look at the difference. Look at the difference it makes. Look at how it went from what you're reading here in the New King James, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, that when she's departed from his house and goes and becomes another man's wife. Look at the difference between that and then the King James translation, then let him write her a bill of divorce, and she may go and be another man's wife. You see that difference? And so I understand why that people are confused. I understand why people believe this is a command. Let him write her a bill of divorce. But it's not a command. It's not a command. It's not even an instruction. According to the Hebrew text, verses 1 and 2 are a description and not a prescription. Now, according to the King James, it's a prescription. But when you read it from the Hebrew text, clearly it is a description, not a prescription. It just tells you what is going on in this situation. There is no commandment or instruction to divorce and remarry, nor does Yahuwah give approval to the practice. Like Yahusha said, he suffered or put up with it because of the hardness of their hearts. Yahusha referenced this in Matthew 19:8, Mark 10, verse 5. And so he suffered it, he put up with it, he allowed it. So obviously, with this situation going on and it not being condemned by Yah, that it was something that he put up with, but it does not mean that he approved of it or instructed it or commanded it. He did none of those things. And so I'm going to give you an example of what I'm talking about as far as Yah suffering and putting up with things, even in the Torah. Other things the Most High suffered because of the hardness of men's hearts. Men were getting into fights with one another. We see this in Exodus 21, verse 18, 22, and then we see it in Deuteronomy 25, verse 11. Yahuwah gave laws to limit the damage done, but doesn't rebuke the fighting itself in those verses. So let me ask a question. Do you believe it was Yah's will that men were fighting like this? Of course it wasn't his will, but we don't see Yah addressing that in these commandments here. We see Yah suffering it. We see him putting up with it, but he limits the damage that was done by men fighting with one another. Men would marry two wives, loving one and hating the other. It's Deuteronomy 21, verses 15 through 17. Yahuwah again limited the damage, but didn't rebuke the hating of one's own wife in this passage. So is that Yah's will for you to love one wife and hate the other? No, that's not his will, but we don't see him dealing with that. We see him suffering it and putting up with it because of the hardness of their hearts. Even Yahusha said to his disciples at one time, I have many things I want to say to you, but you can't bear them now. There are just certain things that because of the condition of the people, they just could not bear. That's why in Hebrews it says that finding fault with them, he made a new covenant. And see, some people, especially Christians, they misquote that. They'll say, yeah, he found fault with the old covenant. He found fault, finding fault with it, he came up with a new. No, it doesn't say finding fault with it. It said finding fault with them, the people, because of the hardness of their hearts. There are just some things that Yah just had our people on training wheels with, even under the Torah, that he raised the bar with when we're in this kingdom age. Praise Yahuwah. Because think about it now. Think about it. I mean, if we're to turn the other cheek, if somebody smites us, how in the world is it going to be acceptable if we're getting in fights with one another today? A bishop, how he's not to be a striker, not to be a brawler. You see, now, and not everybody obeys that now. You got some leaders, they strike, they brawl now. All right, but no, we are not supposed to do that. But we don't even see Yah addressing that here in Exodus 21, verse 18, 22, Deuteronomy 25, 11. Because there is no commandment or instruction or approval given in Torah to divorce and remarry, it is the Most High's prerogative to raise the bar and to fully enforce his creational, universal law governing marriage. So even Paul said in Acts 17, verse 30, that Yah winked at ignorance at one time, but now commands all men everywhere to repent. And so I know he's speaking that about men in general, but as it pertains to Yah's people, we have to understand we can't put Yah in a straitjacket. We can't handcuff Yah and just make it so that we have to bind him to. We see some things in the Torah, and we got to bind him to that. And we say it has to be the exact same in this day and age. Now, if he gives an actual commandment or instructions on something, that's one thing. If he clearly shows approval for something, that's one thing. But when he doesn't, and if you look at it in the Hebrew text, there is no commandment, no instruction, no approval given in Torah to divorce and remarriage, that in that case, because Yah already set the bar in the beginning, it is the Most High's prerogative to raise the bar and to fully enforce his creational universal law governing marriage. The Most High can do what he wants to do. And that's what I see being done with this idea that if Yahusha meant divorce, that would put him in conflict with the Torah, simply because Yah suffered it, put up with it, the divorce and remarriage in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4, that people try to bind him to that, when there's no commandment or instruction to bind him to. Review. Yahusha did not undo any commandment or instructions in Torah by teaching against divorce and remarriage and calling it adultery. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 3, according to the Hebrew text and not the King James, gives a description of divorce and remarriage, not a prescription. The only commandment or judgment given in the passage is verse 4. Yahuwah never rescinded his creational universal law governing marriage. He just suffered men in the hardness of their hearts to live contrary to it in times past, yet now holds all men accountable to it. So the answer to the question above, if Yahusha meant divorce, did that put him in conflict with Torah? The answer is no. Now, before we go on to the challenge questions, I do want to say this. I am going to take a deeper dive into the subject of Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4, because I believe that that's going to be the most relevant when it comes to those of us who are Torah observant, Messianics, Israelites. That's going to be what's of the most significance. That's where people are probably going to have the most questions. So I am going to take a deeper dive. What I have presented before you in part 4 of this series, this is the primer. Okay, we're going to put a couple coats of paint on in the next series that I'm going to do. We're going to zero in on Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4, and we're going to put a couple of coats of paint on this primer. This is just the primer. There is more coming. Challenge questions. Where does the Torah ever command or instruct men to divorce the wife of their covenant and remarry another? Now, I'm talking according to the text. I'm not talking about a translation. I'm talking about Yah's own words. Number 2, if Genesis 2:24 is merely an ideal, then why does Yahuwah enforce it on 2 different occasions in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verses 19 and 29? Now, I say this because if you listen to enough teaching on YouTube from Christians and even Messianics, that a lot of them are saying the same thing about Genesis 2:24. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they two shall be one flesh. And they say, well, that's the ideal. That's the ideal that he set in the beginning. But because of the reality of sin, then they go on with what they're teaching on that. Now, number 3, if the Pharisees look to Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 through 4 as the law of divorce and remarriage, but Yahusha looked to the creational universal law given in Genesis 1:27 and 2:24, why are we following the Pharisees and not Yahusha? And I say this because Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 through 4, this is where everyone wants to run when they want to justify divorce and remarriage. And I can understand why. I'm not going to pass judgment. If all I knew was the King James, then perhaps I would feel the same way. I could understand why. Because they don't know what I've shown you all in this video. Some people, all they know is the King James Bible. They haven't looked into the Hebrew text. They haven't looked at what Yah actually said in that passage. And that's why they, like the Pharisees, they turn it into this law of divorce and remarriage. Now, the sad thing about the Pharisees is they knew what Yah said, and they still twisted it and perverted it. But Yahusha did not use Deuteronomy 24 as his basis. He used the creational universal law, Genesis 1:27 and Genesis 2:24. So why are we following the Pharisees and not Yahusha? Why don't we run to Genesis when we deal with this? Why do we run to Deuteronomy chapter 24? This ends part 4 of the series, Put Away versus Divorce.